Hi guys, this is Erica from Gokce Capital.
Now before I begin, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. In the second decade of the 20th century, two men from separate ends of California had their lives turned into museum exhibitions. The first during his lifetime, the second long after he was dead. These were men at the fringes of society, but their connection to a complicated and mythical piece of American history and the ways of life it both helped to foster and endanger have ensured that their stories keep circulating even today. The first man, William Keyes, came to the stark, boulder-strewn landscape of Southern California over 100 years ago to claim a homestead under the Homestead Act. Surrounded by snakes, scorpions, and Joshua trees, he raised his family and mined the property, eventually amassing a small fortune. His colorful life included time in jail for murder, and his homestead became a small town, with over 20 buildings, including a schoolhouse, store, and supply yard. And you can visit it today at the Joshua Tree National Park. The second man, who walked out of the wilderness in Northern California, represents the other end of the homesteading story, one of loss. But before I get to Ishi's story, I'm going to cover a few brief facts on land grants, those transfers of land from the federal and state governments to railroads, settlers, and institutions, which play such a prominent role in not only the history of the West, but the United States as a whole. So to start, a brief definition of a land grant. A land grant is a gift of real estate, land, or its use privileges, to an individual or institution. Typically, this gift is made by a government or another such authority as an incentive, reward, or a way to encourage settlement and development. Land grants have a long history, but the time period that we tend to think of as the era of land grants came in the wake of a series of federal laws, the bulk of which were introduced during the Civil War, but also spanned the decades prior and after this event. Several of the more definitive laws that allowed for the issuance of land grants include the Land Grant Act of 1850, which began distributing land grants to railroads, the Homestead Act of 1862, perhaps the most famous of all the land grant acts, which allowed for the issuance of land grants to settlers in much of the U.S. west of the Mississippi. The Morrill Act of 1862, which gave grants of land to state governments so that they may be sold and the funds used for the creation of universities. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, which distributed more land to railways, primarily to connect the continent. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which tried to encourage the distribution of land grants to newly freed slaves, and the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which doubled the allotted acreage in marginal areas where conditions were not conducive to farming. But although this particular era of land grant history is perhaps the most widely known, land grants have a much larger history and go back to early colonial times. In the Southwest and Florida, the Spanish Crown granted a series of land grants when Spain owned portions of what is now the United States. These grants were called Mercedes and were generally very large, and many of these historical land grants have a very rich history which continues to today. But it wasn't just in Spanish-held lands that land grants were used. The Virginia Company granted head rights or land grants to immigrants who moved to the newly founded Virginia colony and survived the passage in their first few years. Plymouth County had a similar system of head rights, and eventually Maryland used head rights as well. Number 4. Although the Homestead Act is perhaps the most famous example of a land grant, not every land grant was issued to settlers or individuals. Approximately 180 million acres were given to railway companies, although this number varies depending on whether you include state and local land grants or just federal grants. The purpose of these grants was to encourage the construction of railways that would connect the U.S. both east and west and north and south. In many instances, railways were given in a checkerboard pattern for 20 miles on either side of a proposed rail track. So imagine a checkerboard with the black squares retained under federal ownership and the white squares given to railways. The railroads could then sell this land to help offset the cost of constructing the rail line. So this was done to encourage the creation of much-needed infrastructure, but it was also thought that the remaining public land would increase in value once the railroad was completed. It didn't entirely work out this way, but this was why the government distributed land in a checkerboard pattern, and in much of the West you can still see this pattern today. Number 5. Land grants also funded the creation of over 100 universities. As part of the Morrill Act, states were given land to sell in order to fund endowments for agricultural and technical universities, what we would now consider today STEM-driven universities. And every state has at least one land-grant university. In fact, some of the most famous universities are land-grant universities, such as Cornell and MIT. Number 6. The federal government no longer issues land grants. And the last homestead was given in 1974 to a Vietnam veteran in Alaska. However, a number of towns in the United States do have small homesteading programs that encourage settlement or economic development within the town's boundaries. And you can learn more about these programs on our video on where to find free land in the United States. But let's return to our story of the two Californian men. The second man, Ishi, became famous when he walked out of the Butte County wilds. Ishi was a Yahi man, and over the past 50 years, his family and community had been killed in a series of massacres, part of what is now called the California Genocide. As the last of his band, he was dubbed by the press, somewhat crudely, as the last wild Indian. He was eventually taken by anthropologists at the University of California, Berkeley, and housed at the university, where he was studied and also hired to work as a janitor. Though it is reported that he and the anthropologists developed relationships built on respect, Ishi did spend the last years of his life as a kind of living anthropological exhibit at the university. His story was recently revitalized in an article detailing the history of conflict and displacement tied to land grants given to universities, including Berkeley. Ishi and William Keyes thus represent two sides of one of the most famous federal policies. Land grants to individuals have allowed thousands of families to own land and start farms. The funds from the sale of university land grants have funded institutions in every state that have educated millions, and whose researchers have created the measles vaccine and improved farming practices. But it is also true that most of this land given as land grants were taken, often violently, from Native peoples. History rarely gives us clean stories, but still, we should try to keep alive the narratives of our past, both the uplifting ones and the painful. So land grants will continue to hold a key place in the history of both the West and the country as a whole. Do you have any stories about land grants? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video? You're going to love our Gokce Land Due Diligence program. We'll make you a land due diligence expert in just 7 days. Check it out at gokcecapital.com/glad. And while you're at our website, don't forget to explore our $1 down properties at gokcecapital.com/listings. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. You can email, call, or text, and we will respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and more to come.